So yes, having looked at the gin craze a little bit last week, we're actually going to take a step, or week before, we're going to take a step back. And today I'm going to talk a bit to you about the alehouse of the late 17th century. And unfortunately my eyeline is going to be just there the whole time, which is going to look really odd, but that's because I haven't printed the thing out, so I'm reading off a screen just there. Never mind. Because in the late 17th century, we're a little bit before most of those stronger alcohols come along. They're just starting. But mostly, the English like their beer, and they are definitely big drinkers. Cesare de Saussure, something like that, in 1700, visiting the country, writes, "Would you believe it, though water is to be had in abundance in London, and of fairly good quality, absolutely none is drunk. The lower classes, even the paupers, do not know what it is to quench their thirst with water. In this country nothing but beer is drunk, and it is made in several qualities. Small beer is what everyone drinks when thirsty. It is used even in the best houses, and costs only a penny the pot." People are just drinking beer all the time, even when they can drink water safely. And there is a definite increase in the number of alehouses over the course of the 17th century. Until towards the end of that period, it's been estimated there's one alehouse per roughly 90 people. And when you bear in mind how many of them are children, that's really quite a lot. We tend to see the Restoration after 1660 as being a sort of much more relaxed, sociable time that's going back to games and singing and things like that that had been prevented during the Commonwealth era. And that is a little bit true. There is something to be said for an increased allowance of frivolity at the time, but it's definitely still not a free-for-all. In fact, we know a lot about what's going on in alehouses at the time by attempts to ban those things. Charles II, there's an act about what shouldn't be done in alehouses, which refers to Sunday drinking, swearing, drunkenness, gaming, billiards, cards, dice, ninepins, bowling alleys. What's the point, really? Other things, dancing, archery contests in the backyard, very popular game called shuffleboard, all these things going on. If they hadn't been going on, why would you need to ban them? Inside of an alehouse at this time would be sort of partitioned, and each section would have its own table with benches, candles set out. Some of them will be having bars, although a bar at this point is really just a serving hatch. The first mention of a bar is in 1592. And increasingly the beer is being kept in the cellar out of sight, which is a difference from the medieval alehouse where you could expect to actually see your beer being taken from the barrel in front of you. Increasingly they are out the way. Increasingly the better end of things, the plates are going to be made of pewter or other metals rather than of wood and pottery. Glass is a lot more common. Bottles start coming in a bit more. Bottles of beer, which then in turn means that you can have gassier beers, if that's your thing, although that's not common or particularly popular yet. And all the pubs by this point will have proper signs rather than just stakes outside to say that they are selling ale at this time. There's definitely going to be a lot of singing going on. There is a whole genre of music which are called the good fellowship ballads in the 17th century, which are drinking songs which are very much about emphasising living and enjoying the moment that you're living in, and living in the moment with beer, good company and singing. And people often think that the alehouse at the time is all about escaping your life, but actually there's a sense in which this is very much celebrating your life. It's celebrating the leisure bits of it, certainly, but you're just getting around with some friends and having a good chinwag and a couple of beers. So lyrics be something like, "Here's a health to all good fellows that intend with me to join at the tavern or the alehouse and will freely spend their coin, but for such as hate strong liquor and not for my company, oh, it makes my wits the quicker when I taste it thoroughly." It's not about drinking to oblivion, clearly. He thinks his wits are going to get clearer. It's an idea where the concept of being merry is very big at this time. Merry is the only state you want to be getting to. It is definitely a male-dominated space, Although that said, a lot of the a lot of the people running them are women, and a lot of the bar staff are women, and women do form a significant minority of customers. Some people have estimated maybe a quarter of customers are female. The thing is, women aren't going in there without men. They're either going in with their husbands, or they're going in mixed groups of young people. You don't go in on your own or with other women because it's dangerous to your reputation. People might think you're a prostitute, and it can also just literally be dangerous to your health and well-being. Some women did play games and drink with the best of the men, we know, although it's probably quite rare, and become good fellows, enjoying in that good fellowship. But we generally only find out about it if there's some misbehaviour, if they cross some line. So it's unclear if women can become good fellows without their reputation being at stake by doing that. As for what you're drinking, as I say, it's generally beer. Ale, in the old sense of meaning unhopped beer, is still available in the north of England. That would still be quite standard up here. But the southerners don't think much of it by this point. It's very old-fashioned. So there's a poem by Ned Ward which comments about ale. Base and ignoble phlegm, dull Derby ale, thou canst o' none but brainless sots prevail, chokes them if new, and sour art if stale. This does not sound like a pleasant drink, does it? Meanwhile, just to confuse matters, in the south the word ale is being reinvented, but it's being reinvented to mean a light, dry, bitter beer. And if you actually wanted ale, you'd have to say, I want some unhopped ale. Some of these, there is this development of lots of different types of beer. Like I say, these gassy beers as part of the fermentation process are being developed. That seems to be sort of a hobby for gentlemen, is to develop your own beer. The breweries, meanwhile, are coming up with beers that are almost as strong as wine in some cases. And this is actually the peak of beer production in the country. One commentator says the whole country will soon be nothing but a brewery or distillery, and the inhabitants all drunkards. Some of these places are also selling things like brandy. In 1673, the brewers petition against this. They say, before brandy, we had drunk good strong beer and ale, and all strong laborious people, their bodies requiring after hard labour some strong drink to refurbish them, did every morning and evening use to drink a pot of ale or a flagon of strong beer, because that is going to help them in their work, whereas brandy, they would say, would hinder their work. There is, of course, also this idea that brandy is suspiciously French, unlike good old English beer. And there are other options, sort of variants on wine and variants on beer, but for those you might be more likely to go to a tavern, which would be more likely to serve you wine, for instance, or a specialist place like the Mum House that Pepys visits. Mum is an ale with various spices in it, cardamom, ginger, sassafras, etc. One thing that is very popular in the 17th century is toasting, and it develops in the early 17th century and becomes utterly ridiculous fairly soon after that, in at least some cases. One French visitor says anyone in England who drank at table without doing so, without toasting, to the health of some person present, would be considered to be drinking on the sly, and that would be regarded as an act of incivility. The height of the lunacy of this, pretty much, happens in May 1650 in an alehouse in Milton in Berkshire. You've got a gang of royalists who, it said, out of zeal of affection to their king, began to make toasts to the monarchy. And they start off making fairly sensible toasts, and then they're pledging their life, and then they're pledging everything they own, and so on. And then after a while, they start competitively one-upping each other as to what they can do. And one of them cuts his own skin and gets some blood, and so I'll toast with my own blood. And before you know it, the entire group of them are all toasting with cups of their own blood to the king. And this game continues with them drinking more and more of their own and each other's blood until one eventually stabs himself in the buttocks hard enough that he won't stop bleeding and they have to call in a surgeon. What would you say if you were the alehouse keeper of that particular evening? Oh, it's those lot again. What have they done now? There you go. When the king does in fact come back 10 years later, toasting becomes even more popular in a way. There is plenty of company where it would be dangerous not to toast because it would suggest that you were a Commonwealth sympathiser. Charles II actually issued a proclamation against drunkenness, and within it he says, and you think he's probably speaking about people much like those in that particularly nasty game, he says, "There are a set of men of whom we have heard much, who spend their time in taverns and tippling houses and debauches, giving no other evidence of affection for us but drinking our health, and in inveigling all others who are not of their own dissolute temper." So he's saying, very well, drinking my health, if that's the only thing you're doing, that's not much use, is it? And probably don't do it like that. And actually, it doesn't even get better into the 18th century, really. It remains very, very political. Toasts are the way that that the Jacobites identify each other. For instance, in 1715, there's a couple of early 18th century riots in the northeast, which start off with people refusing to make the right toasts in the right alehouses. And people used to, for instance, if you're a loyal Jacobite, you would raise your glass to toast the king, but you would very carefully position your glass over the water jug on the table, because then you are not toasting the king, you are toasting the king over the water. And non-political ones happen as well, of course. Apparently around 1700 there's a tradition for all the men to toast the women and then all the women to toast all the men. Hannah Woolley reminds people that they should still keep some degree of manners while they're doing that, and says, "This throwing down your liquor as into a funnel would be an action fitter for a juggler than a gentlewoman. Gentlewomen, mind your manners." And it did get very silly. They'd start doing things like drinking as many cups as there were letters in the name of the woman being toasted. Which, is not so bad if your name's Anne, but could get very nasty. And again, they're cutting themselves and putting a little bit of blood in to show their seriousness towards the woman that they are toasting, which I'm not entirely sure the woman is likely to have appreciated. You also are entering the golden age, the first golden age, one should probably say, of the drinking game. And there does seem to be a sense that some of the games are intended to promote this good fellowship, this sort of togetherness. But to actually, whether they're encouraging heavy drinking or actually moderating the heavy drinking, it's very hard to say. It probably depends on the game. There are some examples where it does seem that the drinking games are intended to sort of tame the drinking by providing some degree of structure and this rules-based environment rather than people just sitting and downing litres of whatever. On the other hand, some drinking games definitely do suggest you should drink quite a lot for the game to work, so not sure. Certainly people did get very drunk sometimes when they were doing them. There's one tale of a man who was so drunk that instead of leaving the table, he decided, in something of a feat of dexterity, the best thing he could do would be to pee into his own high-top boot in order to prevent having to get up and go to the loo. Unfortunately, at the very moment that he was in the act of doing this, he was toasted. So he had to stand up to acknowledge the toast. And as it was described at the time, the shameless thing burst out, having till then laid hid under the table, and presented itself. This was a mixed company gathering, and the women apparently all started cackling like geese, because, well, you would, wouldn't you? But he felt a bit stupid. But then, really, he was trying to pee into his own boot. What do you expect? One place, for instance, that has a big, heavy drinking culture that we can tell was among the students at the Inns of Court in London, or the future lawyers and so on. They really go in for it in a serious way. They decided to apply their legal knowledge to what they were doing. One commentator says that there are London drinking schools so that drunkenness is professed with us as a liberal art and science. And the end result of this was a publication called The Laws of Drinking, which actually it's a German document, but one of the students translated it and applied it to the English scene. The full title being A Solemn Jovial Disputation, Theoretic and Practic, Briefly Shadowing the Laws of Drinking. That might be a typo on my part, not sure. And it's basically entertaining a bunch of law students by demonstrating in a sort of comedic fashion how their legal knowledge can be applied to their drinking games. So it lists an awful lot of these games, like, he is a man of no fashion who cannot drink supernaculum, carouse the hunter's hoop, quaff upsy-freezy cross, bows in Pummersant, in Pimlico, in Crambo, with healths, gloves, numps, frolics, and 1,000 other such inventions, as by the bell, by the cards, by the dice, by the dozen, by the yard. So, for instance, upsy-freezy is to drink with your arms laced like that, in a row with the next person. Others might be drinking from the crook of your elbow, or with the glass still on the table, all that sort of dexterity tricks. Which does make it a bit hard to believe that this is about controlling people's boozing, but it definitely was the case that it was manly to hold your drink, and manly to show you could hold a lot of drink, but it was definitely not manly to fail to hold your drink. Passing out from booze was very much not a good thing, and much as now, if you pass out in front of people from excessive drinking, they will find a way to have fun with you. Now, they didn't have marker pens for foreheads back then, but they were able, and we know they did, do things like putting a sack over people's heads, or unlacing their codpiece and leaving them exposed to any passers-by. So, yeah, that's kind of incentive not to get that bad, isn't it? Some of these games, of course, require specialist drinking cups, and this is, of course, very much helped by the way glassware is improving at this time. Some of them are just challenges, of course. As that list up there says, one of them is drinking by the yard. Now, that's going to refer to these yard of ale, which is a drinking vessel which is 1 yard long with a bulbous base, and you have to tip it all the way up and drink it. They're probably more common now, but the first known one that we hear of is in 17th century. It's John Evelyn, who records toasting James II with a yard of ale in Kent in 1683. It was also known as the long glass, the Cambridge yard, and the L glass. But there were other kind of local variants on that. There's one court case that I was looking at in which if people were drunk enough, they would say, "Bring out the fowler," and the fowler was like the challenge drink, and it was a stone pot that would hold about 2 gallons of beer, and that was your challenge, was to drink the fowler. That's a lot of beer. And there was some kind of game involved with that, which ends up leaving one man unconscious, and it ends up becoming a court case. And it turns out that the ringleader who started everybody off on this particular game was the village constable, who was probably supposed to be stopping that sort of thing going on, but never mind. Another kind of cup you get from about this date is called a wager cup, and it's fairly common in this country and also in Holland, also called a maiden cup. And they are really quite clever. They're wood or pewter or silver, but what you get is the figure of a lady with her long dress, and she's also holding a pail above her head. And of course that gives you 2 places that you can keep drink in, and the pail is on a swivel, so it will turn all the way around. So you can fill up the skirt, hold her upside down, fill up the skirt, tip the pail the other way around, fill up the pail as well. You fill them both with wine, and then you have to drink them both without spilling any. That's your challenge. And this was something for lots of ribald remarks and discussions about kissing the maiden and drinking from the maiden and this kind of thing. And there'll be some sort of forfeit if you fail to drink it without spilling some of your wine. In Germany, these cups were sometimes used at wedding banquets, particularly, and the bride and groom, allegedly, well, I can't quite see how this works, would attempt to simultaneously drink from the two different ends of the cup at the same time, without spilling any on, presumably, their best clothes. Some versions of the wager cup, the other thing that you could have in the bottom end of it or in the middle of it is an inset dice. And if you have a dice in there, then as you tip it, that's going to tell you how many more drinks you've got to have, isn't it? A lot of excuses for having another one. Another popular type at the time was the puzzle jug, which you might have seen. This is a little later. This is more an 18th century thing, I think, as they were improving their ability to make them, possibly. But they have been found earlier, as early as the 14th century. Simple ones have been found. And it's just a vessel with lots of holes in different places, and you have to plug the right holes up and drink from the right place, or you end up getting drink all over you. And they come in all sorts of funny shapes. There's one that's from this era that looks like a glass person, a glass man, and the way you end up doing it correctly is to drink through his nose. And of course, if you miss one or two, you end up getting covered in drink and everyone has a good laugh. They quite often have inscriptions on them to that effect, sort of taunting people, saying things like, "Here, gentlemen, come try your skill. I'll hold a wager, if you will, that you don't drink this liquor all without you spill and let some fall." And because it's the 17th century, people are going to gamble on whether you get it right or not, because people are going to gamble on everything at that era. The Dutch have a special one called the mill cup, and the mill cup has a little windmill attached to it. And if there's a tube attached to the cup, and there's a windmill. And what you have to do is blow down the tube, which sets the sails of the windmill going, and then you have to finish the glass before the sails stop turning around. Some of them also have a penalty dial, which can be set to a number to show how many more drinks you need to have if you fail to have this one correctly. It's like, if you drink well, you get to drink some more, and if you drink badly, you get to drink some more. In terms of how much more you should have, there's also something called a pass glass. Pass glass? Who knows? Which is a very tall, narrow beer glass. Unfortunately, very few have survived because they were made of such poor quality glass and they're so easily broken. But in the 17th century, this is a drinking game thing where there are stripes marked down it. In the drinking game, what you have to do is drink exactly down to the next stripe, or exactly 2 stripes down, whatever you're told. And if you overshoot, you have to drink down to the next one. And if you overshoot that, you've got to drink down to the next one. You can only stop when you do exactly the number you're supposed to. Which seems like once you've started losing, you're going to keep on losing, but there you go, if losing is the right word for it. But yes, this measure of can you drink exactly the right amount each time. There are some Dutch paintings that have one of these pass glasses in them, and they can symbolise the temptations of life, and presumably symbolise that you can't only have a little bit of the temptations of life. Once you've started having some, it's easy to have too many. Feel that way about chocolate. Italians, meanwhile, are playing a much more complicated game, potentially, called Passatella, which is basically an excuse to insult each other a lot within the context of the game. So, in the basic version, the group just sit down and begin drinking while setting up particular occasions for which people to insult particular other people around the table. It's a little formalised, but the insults can be as exciting as you like. And there are more complicated versions where one person is the boss and another is the underboss, and there are rules about they get to choose who has how much to drink, and they get to choose who gets to insult who. And apparently these very, very often led to a fight, and I can really see why. But the most complicated, possibly my favourite of the drinking glass or drinking vessel weird inventions of this time, is a clockwork automata from Germany from 1615 or so. And it's a little mechanical drinking game because it is a little object with Diana astride a stag, and the stag has these beautiful pointy antlers. She's got hunting dogs on her leash, and you tipped over the stag's head and filled the stag and the whole of the rest of it with wine. Put it back, and then it's got a key that you turn and you set it buzzing around the table, and it's on wheels, and it'll semi-randomly move its way around the table until it, whoever it stops in front of, it's their job to drink the lot. Or presumably drink as much as you want and set it going to the next person, but, where's the fun in that from their point of view? That's obviously something that would be at a very rich person's house, not something you'd have inside an alehouse, but as you can see, there are plenty of opportunities for people to find ways to get hideously drunk. And that's before you get into all of the other activities that are taking place in here. As I say, there's a lot of games going on. There'll be a lot of pipe smoking going on as well. A lot of singing going on. And apart from the pipe smoking, it sounds like quite a fun place to be, really. But, I can't go in without male company, so there you go. Well, there you have it. Don't go out to a pub. It's not safe. Certainly don't go out to a pub and play any of these drinking games right now. That's definitely not safe. And I'll see you again later. Bye-bye.